Let's begin muscles and muscle tissue. This is actually when I first fell in love with the body in 201 all those years ago, was when we went through all of the structures that we find in muscle fibers and how those act to allow for muscle contraction. It's pretty darn amazing. So as far as types of muscle tissue, we've already talked about our types of muscle tissue and said that we have 3 types. Skeletal muscle tissue is what we'll be talking mostly about for the rest of this chapter and chapter 10. So skeletal muscle tissue, some key words about it. It's voluntary. It's the only thing you have voluntary control over. It's skeletal because it attaches to bones. Another thing we could say about it is that it's striated. Skeletal muscle tissue is striated. It's got a pattern of banding. We can see dark and light stripes or striations. Another thing that we could say about it is the muscle cells come in fibers. So we have muscle fibers. They're very long cells that are as long as the muscle in which they reside. So that's another thing about it. These fibers are formed by the fusion of cells called myoblasts in utero. So each of those myoblasts had a nucleus, and when they come together to fuse one muscle fiber, all of the nuclei come together and make our skeletal muscle fibers multinucleate. So we've got it's voluntary, it's striated, it's multinucleate, our cells are fibers. Cardiac muscle is our next muscle type. And cardiac muscle, we find out making the walls of the heart, or the bulk of the wall of the heart. So we'll just say this makes up the heart wall, or the muscular layer of the heart wall. This is involuntary. You do not have control over your heart rate. Okay, that's not true. Like, if we were to have our heart racing right now, and we're to like sit and stop and breathe and meditate, we'd slow our heart rate. So your cerebrum can kind of override everything to some degree, but you're not going to have massive adjustments in heart rate voluntarily, and when you're not thinking about it, you're absolutely not controlling your heart rate. This is also striated tissue, but we don't have big long fibers. We have branched cells called myocardiocytes or cardiomyocytes. Different books use different names. So here we've got branched cells. They can have 2 to 3 nuclei per cell. Our branched cells are joined by specialized cell junctions called intercalated discs that, I don't know that we need to worry about it too much right now, but it's a combination of a gap junction and a desmosome, so that our cardiac muscle cells are joined and can behave as one functional unit. And all of our cells can contract and relax at the same time. What else do we want to say about this? That's it. The cells would be myocardiocytes or cardiomyocytes. They're not fibers. Then our last type of muscle tissue is smooth. And it's called smooth because it does not have striations. So it uses the same kind of proteins, but different arrangement of them, so that they don't band in this way around smooth muscle. They squeeze smooth muscle cells kind of instead. So they're smooth because they lack striations. They have single nuclei, where each cell has 1 nucleus. They are also involuntary, and we find these in the walls of hollow organs. So, body location, cell shape and appearance, skeletal muscle attached to bones, long fibers that are striated, multinucleate, cardiac muscle found in the heart, branching cells that are striated, multinucleate. You can see these darker bands right here. That's the intercalated disc. So we'll talk more about that next semester. Smooth muscle we find in the walls of our hollow organs. These cells are kind of spindle-shaped, described as spindle-shaped, and single nucleate. Okay. Characteristics of muscle tissue. So this is shared by all muscle tissues, skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. All of our muscle tissue displays what we call excitability, which is the ability to respond to a stimulus. So all muscle tissue is excitable and can respond to a stimulus. That's our first characteristic. It's excitable. It responds to a stimulus. Okay, another thing that all muscle tissue displays is what we call contractility, which is the ability to shorten and generate force. So contractility. We can shorten to generate force. The next characteristic that we have is extensibility, which is the ability to stretch. Or to lengthen. So I can have my muscle at rest and I can stretch it beyond its resting length. How well you do that might depend on how much yoga you do, things like that. But the ability to stretch beyond resting length is extensibility. And then muscles also display elasticity, which is the ability to recoil to resting length. So extensibility is to lengthen, so we'll say beyond resting length. And elasticity is the ability to shorten or recoil to resting length. That's different than contractility. I may be shortening the muscle when I contract it, but I'm generating force. And the contraction is an active process. What's cool is, so elasticity would work both ways. When I contract, it'll bounce me back to resting length. If I were to stretch, I can bounce back to resting length. Elasticity is actually cool. What happens is that as we're contracting and squashing up, we're squashing up a little protein there that will just give us a bunch of potential energy, and when we stop contracting, we pop back to our resting length. So that's kind of important characteristics of all of our muscle types. Muscle functions. As far as muscle functions go, some functions are shared by all muscle types and some are just provided by skeletal muscle. So first, let's just think about what all muscle types do. All muscle types move something. So an important function of muscle is movement. What does skeletal muscle move? Skeletal muscle moves your bones. It pulls on bones. What does cardiac muscle move? It doesn't move your heart, really. It moves your blood. By pumping, it causes the pumping motion that's going to allow for the movement of blood. So I would say cardiac muscle contraction moves blood. And smooth muscle contraction moves whatever's in the organ. So it could be food, like if I swallow food and I'm mixing it with gastric juice, that's going to become chyme. That then goes into the small intestine. So it could be chyme that I'm squeezing on. It could be feces in the large intestine. We saw that there were still feces remaining in the large intestine of our cadaver. Blood. So whatever's moving through the hollow organ is what's moved by smooth muscle. So whatever is in the organ. So there are other organs that move blood. Blood vessels move blood as well, and the smooth muscle in them can help to shunt blood around different areas. Okay. The other thing that muscles really, everything else is pretty much skeletal muscle. So skeletal muscles also produce heat. So they're your major producer of body temperature. So we'll say they give body temperature. And that's because heat is this weird byproduct of cellular respiration, and your skeletal muscles are always contracting to some level to give us muscle tone. And then as we use them, then they're going to be doing even more cellular respiration. So they're our biggest producer of body heat. So that's another important function of skeletal muscle. And then this helps to stabilize joints, or stabilize or support joints. That's going to be another function of skeletal muscles. As we saw in that first video, the glenohumeral joint has a ton of muscles around it and supporting it. And then the last thing that really skeletal muscle is going to do is to help you to maintain posture. And that's due to muscle tone, and also due to this helping with the stabilization of joints. If we've got some level of contraction around our joints and things, then that can help you to be sitting upright, even if you're falling asleep in class. So we'll say muscle tone helps to maintain body position and posture. And so that's another important function. Okay, questions, characteristics or functions. All we're going to get through today is anatomy, and we'll pick up with physiology tomorrow. And I'll tell you what I want you to review to be ready for physiology tomorrow. But if we look, the anatomy is really complex, and it's going to give rise to the physiology. So let's just make sure we're really comfortable with that. If we look at a whole muscle, we've already said that muscles have nerve and blood supply. As we've been talking and watching the videos, they'll say, oh, it's innervated by the femoral nerve. It's probably supplied by the femoral artery. We'll worry about all of the arteries and blood vessels next semester. We're not going to worry about all of the names of the nerves serving our organs. Just be aware that all of our muscles have nerves and blood supply. So why do they have to have that? Well, the nerve is going to contain our lower motor neurons. So if we think about a muscle, then why does it have to have a nerve and blood supply? The nerve is going to contain the lower motor neurons that serve the muscle, and the blood supply is going to bring a continuous supply of oxygen and glucose. So we need a continuous supply of nutrients and oxygen. Now you can say, oh, but our muscle can go in anaerobic respiration. We've all had muscle aches when we produce lactic acid. That's true. We can go into anaerobic respiration, but not for horribly long, and it's not going to be ideal. So either way, we need blood and to get there to bring us our oxygen and nutrients. But we also need the veins there to drain waste. So all of those byproducts need to be taken away from the muscle as well. If we've got lactic acid built up, we need to stretch, we need to drink water, we need to rinse it out. So we'll remove waste and bring our nutrients. That's why we need blood vessels. Now, our muscle has connective tissue sheaths just like our nerve did, and it's arranged in the same way. So if I've got this whole muscle, here's its tendon and it's going to a bone. This whole entire muscle is surrounded in a connective tissue sheath. What was it called in a nerve? And if we're talking about the whole entire nerve was surrounded in epineurium. So this is going to be epimysium, is the connective tissue. Epi means upon. Mes, myo, sarco, all of those are referring to muscle. So this mes is for muscle. So upon the muscle, I have my epimysium. And this is dense, irregular connective tissue. which is going to allow my muscle to resist tension in many directions. Yeah?
So that surrounds the whole muscle, not just the muscle cell?
That's endomysium, is inside. So I had to make sure I was going the right direction. Yes, epimysium surrounds the entire muscle. And what I like about this little picture here is then we see, oh, this entire muscle is attached to a tendon. And here's my bone. So right here, I've got dense regular connective tissue. And actually, before I get to the tendon, I've got this stuff, well, like in here. So I've got bone and tendon, and then I've got fascia, deep fascia. If you've ever been rolfed, you know what fascia is. Rolfing is this really crazy kind of stretching and massage where they like stretch all your muscles and all your fascia so that they like stretch it on your bone. And so what a lot of times you miss is that between your tendons and your epimysium is dense irregular connective tissue. Tendon is dense regular connective tissue. So as we're switching, there's kind of a switch off and going from this real regular arrangement of collagen fibers to this all over arrangement. And that is called deep fascia, and that, that is where a lot of your tension and stuff holds up, is in between those connections. And so just kind of be aware of that. I like looking at that picture because it lets you see like how this muscle is actually attached to that bone. So if we zoom in, like, well, we kind of like from here, we're zooming out from bone, like these really strong tissue in. So if we zoom in now and we look into this muscle, we would see that there are fascicles of muscle fibers that are surrounded also in connective tissue. Each of those fascicles is surrounded by what we would call perimysium. Just like we had perineurium around fascicles of neurons, we have perimysium around fascicles of muscle fibers. And this is also dense, irregular connective tissue that can resist tension in many directions. And so, I wish I was a little buffer. Because, man, when I used to be super buff, you could see the fascicles in my arms in class. And when you're really buff, you can see your fascicles in your muscles. All of these bands of fibers running together. And so, they're surrounded by perimysium, dense irregular connective tissue again. Now, if I look at each individual muscle fiber, it's going to be surrounded, so look in this fascicle, it's got a lot of muscle fibers. Each individual muscle fiber is surrounded in endomysium. And endomysium does the same thing for muscle fibers that endoneurium did for neurons, which is what? Insulate, electrically insulate. So what kind of tissue is it? Areolar connective tissue. So if we look at that, then we have areolar connective tissue here, electrically insulating each of our muscle fibers. Get a whole bunch of muscle fibers together in a fascicle, surrounded in dense irregular connective tissue called perimysium. Get a whole bunch of fascicles together, surrounded in dense irregular tissue called epimysium, and now we have a whole muscle. That epimysium is going to blend into your deep fascia and change from dense irregular connective tissue to dense regular connective tissue that now pulls on these bones. What bone is this? It's the femur. The femur is the only bone with trochanters. And as you're learning to walk and pulling on these muscles, that's what pulls those trochanters out. So isn't that cool to think about? How these muscles, which are different organs, though, like reach out and grab and shape that bone. So I think it's pretty cool. Okay, so this is kind of showing you our different connective tissue sheaths. As far as attachments go, we've talked about origins and insertions. We can have direct or indirect attachments. So this here, a tendon directly attaching to a bone, is a direct attachment. Versus like an aponeurosis is an indirect attachment, where if we look on top of our skull, this muscle is called the epicranius, and it's got a frontal belly and an occipital belly, and they're attached by the epicranial aponeurosis. It's indirect. That's all we're going to worry about for muscle attachments.